Part 2. An Ambassador for Islam. Surely you are the one who sent Muhammad as the final messenger for mankind, and the Quran as our guide. Chapter 11. Third Culture. In 7th grade, I finally made lasting friends. David, Ben, and Rick were like brothers to me, and we did everything together. Ami reluctantly realized that I was getting older, and she gradually let me spend more and more time outside of our home. Usually I was out for some kind of extracurricular activity, and sometimes she'd let me go to a friend's house for a few hours. But before I launched into my teenage years, Ami had a serious talk with me. Late one evening, just after our family finished praying the Isha Salat, Ami stopped me before I left the prayer rugs. "Nabeel, stay here for a moment." Immediately, I sensed that this was not going to be a normal conversation. "What is it, Ami?" "Beta, I wish there were some Muslim boys in your school so you wouldn't be alone in representing Islam and so you would have true companionship. But that was not Allah's will. Always remember this. No matter where you are or what you are doing, you are an ambassador for Islam. You will always be an ambassador for Islam." I listened with care, drawn in by her sincerity and intensity. "When people see your face, they will think, 'He is a Muslim boy.' It doesn't matter what you are doing. It doesn't matter what you do. You could be the valedictorian, and they will think, 'Look at the Muslim valedictorian.' You could be the President of the United States, and they will think, 'Look at the Muslim president.' In the West, Islam is foreign to people, and many of them are opposed to it. They will always see you first and foremost as a Muslim. That is your identity, and you must embrace it." Ammi did not often speak like this. Her words imbued me with a sense of responsibility. I concentrated hard on her words, wrinkling my brows. She embraced me and held me close. "Bilu, don't worry. This is a good thing. It is a blessing and an opportunity for you to represent Islam and to help people understand its beauty. Become the valedictorian so people will think, 'Wow, Islam produces good students.' Become the president so people will think, 'Islam makes good leaders.' But even if you become a janitor, be the very best." I nodded in affirmation, despite my doubts that she would be okay with a janitorial career. "Shabash, beta. Whatever you do, be the most respectful, honest, and dignified one doing it, so that people will praise Islam. Treat your teachers with the utmost respect. Treat them like you would treat me. When I visit them, I want to hear them tell me that you are the most respectful student in the class. Drinking is not allowed in Islam, but you must also never curse and never spend time alone with girls. Be such a virtuous person that no one can even point a finger of blame at you. In their hearts, they will praise you because they will know you are honorable, or they will dislike you because they dislike themselves. Either way, they will know that Islam has made you the good person you are." And that is what I did. At school, I shared my Islamic beliefs with people who would listen. I stood up for the things that mattered to me, and I worked hard to uphold my morals and reputation. I knew people in my grade who were drinking, doing drugs, and having sex, even though we were only 7th graders. Thankfully, none of my friends were engaged in these activities, and it was not too hard for me to continue representing Islam the way I always had. But things were changing. Adolescent years are difficult for everyone. Teens develop their own identities and gradually break away from the one that their parents built for them. Each circumstance presents its own set of challenges. The challenge in our family, both for Baji and me, was that the direction of pull was not just toward a different personality, but toward an entirely different paradigm. We were left straddling a chasm, with our feet firmly planted in neither culture. The first change I noticed was at family gatherings. Almost all of Ammi's siblings lived in the Northeast, and we met many times a year. As I came into my teenage years, my parents, aunts, and uncles expected me to act like a good Pakistani teenager, and I wanted to be a good Pakistani teenager for them. The problem was that I had never been intimately acquainted with a good Pakistani teenager, so I didn't know what one acted like. That wasn't something Ami could teach. I ended up trying to emulate my older male cousins and my younger uncle in their manner of speech, but apparently I lacked some of the finesse required to walk the line between witty and rude in Pakistani culture. That was something I could do in American culture just fine, in fact, charmingly so. I began getting in trouble with my parents fairly frequently on our way back from family trips for being disrespectful. I also realized that I asked far too many questions for my relatives' tastes. In our culture, elders are simply to be obeyed. Obedience is what shows them that you respect them and, in certain contexts, love them. Questions are often seen as a challenge to authority. In school, though, our teachers taught us critical thinking and that it was good to question everything. My mind was being shaped to think critically, but that shape did not fit into our culture. This is not to say I didn't have unsavory character traits of my own. I certainly did. I was a prideful and self-serving youth, and that got me into plenty of trouble too. Good parents help shape and guide their children beyond these flaws, as mine tried to do. But some of what my parents saw as impertinence was actually a culture clash. I was cut out of different cultural cloth than they were. They thought I was fine Pakistani linen, but I was more of an Asian American cotton blend. The same was unfortunately true at school. I was far too Pakistani to fit in well with my American friends. There was always a barrier, no matter how much we did together or how close we became. I will never forget the last week of middle school, when there was an end-of-the-year school celebration. We were receiving our senior superlatives, and I was given the superlative, most likely to invent the pocket computer and then leave it in his pants on wash day. The evening was good fun until it was time to take pictures. When my friend Ben wanted a picture with his best friends, he asked to take it with just David and Rick. It was like an icy knife through my heart. It actually still hurts to think about that incident, but it wasn't his fault. I just couldn't fit in perfectly anywhere. No one understood that, not even I. I was no longer of traditional Pakistani culture, and I was no longer of American culture. I had a third culture, and no one met me there. Chapter 12. Muslims in the West. Lying flat on my stomach, I peered between railings at a secret meeting on the floor below. Our family had gathered earlier that day for my grandfather's funeral services. Emotions ran high, but an additional unstated tension had been present throughout the day. Though the adults had sent me and my cousins to bed, I had snuck out. I needed answers. An older cousin sat at the end of my uncle's living room, her face in her palms, the elders positioned around her in a semicircle. The atmosphere was thick with concern and melancholy. No one spoke. Finally, my grandmother softly broke the silence. "Are you still pure?" Like lightning, my cousin's mother interjected. "Of course she is!" But all eyes were trained on my cousin. Slowly, without lifting her face from her hands, she nodded. Ame began to berate my cousin in a tone that I had heard her use only on Baji, though in matters far less severe. "If you are pure, then forget him. Move on, and get married to a good Ahmadi Muslim before our reputation is tarnished any further. Or at least a non-Ahmadi Muslim. But a Hindu? Astaghfirullah." Through tears and fingers crossed over her face, my cousin whimpered, "But I love him." One aunt snickered and spoke under her breath. I can't believe her mind could be so dysfunctional. Turning to my cousin, she chided, "You don't know what love is. Don't become Americanized. Listen to your elders." There was another break in the conversation, and the silence intensified the emotions. The men in the room did not speak. Their presence served simply to validate the gravity of the discussion and to anchor the women's emotions. After a few moments, my cousin's mother added, "Your grandfather was a missionary. Can you imagine how he must have felt when he found out his own offspring dishonored our heritage, dishonored Islam?" "We don't have to imagine," my grandmother suggested, looking directly at my cousin. "It is because of what you've done that he isn't here anymore." This was the only personal accusation I ever heard my grandmother make. It was spoken out of an Eastern sense of tough love, but to this day it haunts my cousin. She was not the only one, though, who collided over these matters with the extended family. The culture clash of immigrant parents with their Western born children is especially common during the emotionally stormy teenage years, and it serves to illustrate a vital fact. Muslim immigrants from the East are starkly different from their Muslim children born in the West. People from Eastern Islamic cultures generally assess truth through lines of authority, not individual reasoning. Of course, individuals do engage in critical reasoning in the East, but on average it is relatively less valued and less prevalent than in the West. Leaders have done the critical reasoning, and leaders know best. Receiving input from multiple sources and then critically examining the data to distill a truth is an exercise for specialists, not the common man. This phenomenon creates stark dichotomies in the minds of Muslims raised in these cultures. An entity is either a source of authority or it isn't. It is either trustworthy or suspect. It is either good or it is bad. Shades of gray are far less common among authority-based cultures. For the most part, Eastern teachers have taught the Muslims that the West is Christian, that its culture is promiscuous, and that the people oppose Islam. So the average Muslim immigrant expects people in the West to be promiscuous Christians and enemies of Islam. When they come to America, their cultural differences and preconceptions often cause them to remain isolated from Westerners. Like Ami, many develop relationships only with other expatriates from their country, so their perspectives are never corrected. What is worse, some Muslims do receive poor treatment from Westerners and Christians, and this only serves to bolster their notions that all Westerners and Christians are the same way. On the rare occasion that someone does invite a Muslim to his or her home, differences in culture and hospitality may make the Muslim feel uncomfortable, and the host must be willing to ask, learn, and adapt to overcome this. There are simply too many barriers for Muslim immigrants to understand Christians in the West by sheer circumstance. Only the exceptional blend of love, humility, hospitality, and persistence can overcome these barriers, and not enough people make the effort. That explains why our families fight hard to keep us from becoming Americanized. The term had nothing to do with nationality. It had everything to do with their perception of the culture. To be Americanized was to be disobedient to your elders, to dress less conservatively, and to spend more time with your friends than your family. Cursing, drinking, and dating were simply unfathomable. One of the greatest travesties of all is that Muslim immigrants often associate Western immoralities with Christianity, and correlation becomes causation in the minds of the uncritical. The West is Christian. The West is Americanized. Ergo, it is Americanized because it is Christian. Christianity, in the minds of many Muslims, has produced this promiscuous, domineering Western culture. Christianity, therefore, must be ungodly. I remember pointing out to Ami and Abba that the people dressed provocatively on television might not be Christian, and their response was, "What do you mean? Don't they call themselves Christian? Don't you see them wearing crosses?" If I argued that some of them may be Christian in name only, and might not even believe in God, they responded that this simply means that they were Christians who don't believe in God. They did not categorize religion with belief, but with cultural identity. The tragedy here is that no one has given them a reason to think otherwise. If they were to intimately know even one Christian who lived differently, their misconceptions might be corrected, and they might see Christianity in a virtuous light. All of this is different from their children, for second-generation Muslims in the West. The second generation is as varied and disparate as their peers. If anything can be said of them, it is this. Almost universally, they see the world as Westerners, and yet still align themselves with Islam. Some may be, as I was, raised to think critically, and yet still love Islam. I have many highly educated female cousins who wear the burqa and are willing to defend that choice with thoughtful reasons. Others, like a few of my male cousins, have rejected everything about Islam and their culture, with the exception of the title Muslim. Whether a young Muslim stays connected with his culture or becomes nominal often has to do with pressures in the culture clash. If the parents are extremely devout, as mine were, then there is far more of a chance that the child will try to live a traditional lifestyle. If the parents are nominal, there is little chance the child will care more than nominally for Islam. Who the child's friends are and what they believe is also highly influential, as well as what they learn in school. Baji grew to see things differently from me. She still wears a burqa and loves Islam, but she has blended Islam with Western pluralism. She believes that Allah can lead people to Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, or any other religion, and they can still attain salvation because all paths lead to Allah. She believes this even though we were raised in the same house. Her experiences outside the home shaped her quite differently from me. As for my cousin, though she eventually came around and did not marry the Hindu boy, it is unlikely that she will ever fully recover from that episode. One of my male cousins was reprimanded when he tried to marry a Filipino, but he came around and fully recovered, ultimately marrying a Pakistani girl. Another of my male cousins wanted to marry an American girl, was reprimanded, and then went ahead and married her anyway. All of these second-generation American Muslims are my relatives. They all trace their lineage back to the same town in Pakistan. They were raised in the same Jamaat, and they are roughly the same age. Yet they all see the world and process it extremely differently. Perhaps most significant of all, none of them see the world as their parents do, not even close. Yet they all call themselves Muslim and identify themselves with their parents' faith. What, then, does it mean to be Muslim in the West? It can mean anything. If you really want to know what someone is like and what they believe, you have to get to know them and ask them personally. But the best we can do before getting to know someone is to determine whether he is an immigrant or a second-generation Muslim. This one factor often makes a huge difference. Chapter 13. Swoons and Substitutions. My particular blend of East meets West was shaped by Islamic apologetics. I did not have to wrestle long with some of the postmodern relativism that captures my generation. To me, it was self-evident that truth exists. What's the alternative? If truth doesn't exist, then it would be true that truth doesn't exist, and once again we arrive at truth. There is no alternative. Truth must exist. Traditionally, Muslims and Christians have shared this understanding. Each believes in truth, not the least because they believe their faith is true. But their common perspective extends much farther. They have roughly analogous beliefs in monotheism, spiritual and physical realms, angels and demons, good and evil, a final judgment, heaven and hell, the inspiration of scriptures, and many more peripheral beliefs. These commonalities are a double-edged sword. They build a common platform for dialogue such that the two can often understand each other and see the world from a similar perspective. But the commonalities perhaps also serve to sharpen disagreements on the most sensitive difference between the two faiths, their views of Jesus and Muhammad. Christians believe Jesus is God incarnate, and this is a necessary belief for Orthodox Christianity. Muslims believe that Jesus is no more than a prophet, and to consider him God incarnate would be blasphemy and would cause one to be condemned to hell eternally, according to the Quran. Muslims believe Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and this belief is so important that it makes up half the Shahada, the primary proclamation of Islam. Christians believe that those who teach contrarily to the gospel of salvation through Jesus are false teachers. This difference in beliefs is why dialogue between Muslims and Christians has mostly focused on Jesus and Muhammad. As a young teenage Muslim, to be an effective ambassador for Islam, I thought it was my duty not only to have an unimpeachable reputation, but also to have a command over these points of contention. Regarding Muhammad, Westerners rarely knew anything. I could say whatever I wanted about him and others would believe me. Of course, I did not try to deceive anyone, but it was not hard to make a case for Muhammad to the average Christian simply because of their ignorance. I shared with them all the things I learned in my early childhood about Muhammad, especially his mercy upon returning to Mecca, and I was able to leave people with a much more positive impression about Muhammad and Islam than they had before. Regarding Jesus, there are two issues on which Muslims particularly disagree with Christians: that Jesus died on the cross and that Jesus claimed to be God. The Quran specifically denies both of these beliefs. To be a good ambassador, I just had to master these two issues and persuasively argue that Jesus never claimed to be God, nor did he die on the cross. For the latter, the founders of our sect had written a small book to equip the Jamaat. It was called Jesus in India, and I had read it many times. My first opportunity to argue what I had learned was on a school bus in front of our middle school while we were waiting to go home. It was shortly before Easter, and I was discussing my plans for the upcoming school break with my friend Kristen. Our class had let out early, so we got on the bus before it was crowded. We were some of the oldest kids, so that secured us seats toward the back. We sat down across the aisle from one another as she told me her plans for Good Friday. Good Friday? I had no idea what she meant. Good Friday is the day Jesus died on the cross. What's good about that? That's how he took our sins, by dying on the cross. Her answer was straightforward, but I was amused. I had been told this is what Christians believed, but no one had ever said it to me before. How does his death on a cross take away your sins? That's what they told us at church. I don't know. We don't go to church a lot. I never asked. Kristen wasn't being defensive, she was being honest. That was one of the reasons I enjoyed talking with her. She was brutally honest and intimidatingly intelligent. I later developed a little crush on her, but I wouldn't admit it to myself. To do that, I would have had to compromise my culture, and that was not an option. I was an ambassador, but I did allow myself to be mean to her boyfriend. I decided to redirect the conversation. Well, I don't think he died on the cross anyway. Why's that? She was intrigued, so I started with my trump card. Because of the Bible. What do you mean? Well, first, we know that Jesus didn't want to die on the cross. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed that God would take the bitter cup away from him. Obviously, the bitter cup was his impending death on the cross, and Jesus prayed all night that God save him, to the point where he was sweating drops of blood. I paused and waited for her affirmation. She nodded. I don't know about you, but I think God loved Jesus. There is no way that God would let Jesus' prayers go unheard. In fact, I think the book of Hebrews says that. Anyways, when Jesus was put on the cross, if you do the calculations, you can see that he was on the cross for only 3 hours. Hanging on a cross for 3 hours doesn't kill you. People lasted on the cross for days at a time. He was taken down too quickly. She looked like she was processing everything, and I paused a moment to see if she would ask the obvious question. She did. So why was he taken down? Exactly why the Bible says. Pilate commanded that he be taken down. Pilate's wife had seen a dream and begged her husband that he not allow Jesus to be killed. She must have been able to persuade her husband to save him after the Jews were convinced that he was crucified, so Pilate gave the order to take Jesus down from the cross. That's when Jesus was placed in the tomb. I stopped, because it was clear Kristen had an objection. But his disciples saw him afterward, and they thought he had risen from the dead. How could they have thought that if they took him down? I didn't say the disciples took him down. It was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Pilate couldn't be seen working with the disciples because that would make it obvious he was helping Jesus. So he worked with Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Joseph took Jesus' body and put it in the tomb, and Nicodemus brought 100 pounds of aloe and other medicines, along with linen bandages, to heal Jesus. God used the medicines to heal Jesus while he was in the tomb for those 3 days. Kristen interjected with a question that I hadn't thought of. But why would God do all this to save Jesus? Couldn't he have just taken Jesus up to heaven a few days earlier if he didn't want Jesus to die on the cross? That was pretty sharp. I hadn't seen it from that angle. but our Jamaat had given me an answer for the reason why Allah wanted Jesus to live. Jesus himself says he was sent for the lost sheep of Israel. The lost sheep were the tribes of Jews who were scattered over Asia during the Jewish diaspora. Allah saved Jesus from death on the cross so he could go to the lost sheep and reform Judaism there, as he did in Israel. We had been so engrossed in conversation that we hadn't noticed the students filing into the bus. In the seat in front of me, a boy who was one grade behind us had been listening attentively, apparently reaching his threshold. He caught our attention with a noisy grunt of contempt, and, after looking at me, turned around angrily toward the front and said, "Disgusting." I thought to myself, if he had an argument, he'd share it. Truth silences falsehood. Kristen had seen him too and looked at me to make sure I wasn't offended. I wasn't, but she went ahead and said loudly, "I think it's a very interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing." The argument I shared with Kristen, often called the swoon theory, is shared by Ahmadi Muslims and non-Ahmadi Muslims alike. It is a favorite among Muslim debaters like Ahmad Didat and Shabir Ali. It originated at the end of the 18th century when the Age of Enlightenment began generating naturalistic theories to account for Jesus' apparent resurrection. Muslims like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad had added a theistic twist to it, making it more plausible that Jesus could survive crucifixion. The argument goes, if God can do the large miracle of raising Jesus from the dead, why can he not do the much smaller miracle of keeping him alive on the cross? The swoon theory is not the original Muslim explanation for Jesus' apparent death, though, nor is it the majority view. Most Muslims believe the substitution theory. Early in Islamic history, it was argued that Jesus was substituted before being placed on the cross. Allah put Jesus' face on someone else, and that person was crucified in Jesus' place. This was how they interpreted the Quranic verse, "Jesus was neither killed nor crucified, but so it appeared." The question naturally arises, who was killed in Jesus' place? Different people have been suggested. Some say it was a devout young volunteer who wanted the honor of dying for Jesus. Others say that when Simon of Cyrene carried the cross for Jesus, they crucified him instead. Yet others say that Allah put Jesus' face on Judas' body for poetic justice. The last view seems to be the most popular today. Another majority view regards Jesus' ascension. The Quran teaches that Allah raised Jesus to himself, leading Muslims to believe in the ascension and eventual return to Jesus. So, like Christians, most Muslims are waiting for the return of the Messiah. Our Jamaat challenged this view because Ahmad claimed to be the Messiah. Appealing to the Bible, he argued that the Jews were mistakenly waiting for the return of Elijah from the sky. Jesus said John the Baptist was the return of Elijah. In the same way, the world was waiting for the return of Jesus, but Ahmad was he. Of course, I vehemently argued whatever my Jamaat had taught me, so I provided the swoon theory and the position that Jesus traveled to India where he died at an old age instead of ascending. The more I shared my views, the more I felt confirmed in my faith, and the conversations occurred with increasing frequency when I realized no one had anything substantial to rebuff my views. I felt I had mastered half of the arguments I needed to be a good ambassador for Islam, and I felt that the other half was going to be even easier to argue. And I was right. It was. For much more detail on the Muslim view of Jesus' crucifixion, read Part 6 of No God But One, titled, Did Jesus Die on the Cross? Chapter 14. The Father is Greater Than Jesus. By the time I was in 10th grade, my personal life was changing significantly. I began to spend far more time with friends, both on the phone and at school during activities. I was much more concerned with my clothing, which Ammi was still picking out for me. I started to ask Ammi if I could wear contact lenses instead of glasses in an effort to combat the nerd reputation that I had acquired. No success. The tug of Western culture was becoming difficult to resist. I was still not allowed to go to sleepovers, nor was I allowed to go to school dances. My friends and I had grown close, and that made my absence from these events all the more difficult. But I still represented Islam proudly, especially when my beliefs were directly addressed, as they were one day while I was in Latin class. At Princess Anne High School, Latin was taught by two teachers, both of whom were thrilled when their students enjoyed the class. The teacher who taught Latin, too, Mrs. Earles, was far more kind and lax with me than she ought to have been. I loved Latin, and I loved her class, but I was getting more mischievous by the day, goaded by a lack of reprimand. I was the kind of student who forgot to do his homework quite often, and upon remembering a few hours before it was due, I tried to squeeze in a way to get it done. Mrs. Earle's class was right before Spanish, and I often did my Spanish homework while she was lecturing. I would hide my Spanish textbook under my Latin textbook, working on it whenever she turned her eyes to the chalkboard, thinking that she was oblivious. Halfway through the year, I realized she wasn't oblivious at all, just highly tolerant of my shenanigans. I was working on my Spanish homework on one of these occasions when the girl in front of me turned around and said, "Nabeel, can I ask you something?" Her name was Betsy, and she was the outspoken Christian in our grade. Everyone knew she was an evangelical Christian, and she often stood up for her faith. Despite her kindness and desire to help others, she had a soft yet adamant demeanor that made the rest of us uneasy. We thought she was a bit loony. Yeah, sure. I had no idea where this was going. Had she wanted a pencil, she wouldn't have asked to ask me something. She would have just asked for the pencil. Nor would I have been the one she'd ask, for that matter. I always forgot my pencils. She paused for a moment, steeling herself before asking, "Do you know about Jesus?" Now I knew she was crazy. We were in the middle of Latin class. All the same, I immediately gained respect for her. Why had other Christians never asked me this question? They did think I needed Jesus to go to heaven, right? Were they content with letting me go to hell, or did they not really believe their faith? I considered how to approach my response in the present context. I looked up from my Spanish homework to assess the situation. Mrs. Earles had apparently stepped out for an indefinite period, and most of the students were chatting around us. I didn't know how far I wanted to go, because I knew I could quickly get passionate and carried away. I decided to keep my answers short. Yes. Her eyes went wide. That was clearly not the answer she was expecting. Really? What do you think about him? Well, I'm Muslim, right? Muslims believe that Jesus was sinless and born of the Virgin Mary. He cleansed the leprous, gave sight to the blind, and raised people from the dead. Jesus is the Messiah, the Word of God. Betsy was stunned. I must have gone off script because she did not know where to go from there, so I proceeded for her. But Jesus was not God. He was just a man. I had drawn the battle lines for her and waited to see how she went to war. Wow, you know a lot more about Jesus than I thought. That's great. I believe a lot of the same things, but I don't agree completely. Would you mind if I shared my view? She responded softly, yet adamantly, employing the very sneaky maneuver of being herself. Sure, go ahead. This was getting interesting. Well, I don't know if you know, but I'm a Christian. Yeah, I thought so, I smiled, thinking to myself, the whole world knows you're Christian, Betsy. She beamed, genuinely happy that I knew she was Christian. We believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that's very important to us. Because he was the Son of God, he had no sin and was able to take our sins upon himself. I had many problems with that statement, but I had already drawn the battle lines, so I stuck with the issue of Jesus' deity. I decided to take a concessionary approach. Betsy, I don't think the Bible we have today is the Word of God. It's been changed too many times throughout history. But for now, let's just say I did think so. Where does Jesus say, "I am God"? Betsy thought for a moment. She didn't seem too troubled, but it was clear to me she couldn't remember him saying it. After an uncomfortable moment passed, which she seemed totally comfortable with, she said, "In John's Gospel, Jesus says, 'The Father and I are one.'" That was the one I expected her to go for, and I was ready. Yeah, but also in John, Jesus prays for his disciples to be one just as he is one with the Father. So he clarifies exactly what he means by one. He means unified in spirit and will. If he meant one as in one being, would he be praying for his disciples to be one in the same way? He's not praying for his disciples to all become one being, is he? That's a good point, she said thoughtfully. Good point. I was in the process of dismantling her worldview, and she was being congenial? Did this girl ever get agitated? Well, I can't think of it right now, but I'm sure it's there. I can look it up and get back to you. I'd love for you to, Betsy, but you won't find anything. Jesus never said he was God, I argued. He made the opposite quite clear to us. He felt the pangs of hunger, thirst, loneliness, and temptation. He cried and he bled. He didn't call himself the Son of God. He called himself the Son of Man. He was very obviously human. Betsy was nodding along. Yes, I agree. Jesus is a man, and he is God too. How can someone be man and God? Man is mortal, God is immortal. Man is limited, God is infinite. Man is weak, God is omnipotent. To be man is not to be God, and to be God is to not be man. This seemed to give her some pause. She was off balance, so I decided to push a bit harder. When Jesus went to Galilee, Mark's Gospel tells us he could do no miracles. Not that he chose not to, but that he couldn't. Can God not do miracles? When a woman in a crowd touched him, he had no idea who it was. Would God not know something that simple? After pausing to let her process, I continued. When a man called him good, he said that he is not good, only God is good. He draws a distinction between himself and God. He does it again when he said he didn't know when the world will end, and that only God knows. He's making it very clear that he is not God. Betsy said nothing. She had not thought of this before. I decided it was time for the coup de grace. Betsy, in case there is any question, in the Gospel of John, Jesus said, "The Father is greater than I," and I agree with Jesus. God is greater than he is. I think you ought to agree with him too. Betsy didn't know what to say. I waited. Well, I don't know what to say. She was sticking with her signature maneuver. I'll tell you what. I'm going to look into these things. In the meantime, I'd like to invite you to a play at our church that I'm a part of. Would you like to come? Sure, sounds like fun, but I don't have a driver's license yet. Mind if my dad comes along? Of course not. Bring as many people as you'd like. Here's the information. Let me know what day you're coming when you get a chance. Betsy handed me a flyer for the event and smiled. I saw something behind the eyes of her smile that I hadn't seen in her before. She was agitated. I smiled back. For much more detail on the Muslim view of Jesus, read Part 8 of No God But One, titled, Did Jesus Claim to be God? Chapter 15. Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. I was very excited to be invited to a church. I had been to one before, a Catholic church, and I remember that day as an exciting, Latin-infused blur. Honestly, it was so confusing that I could not figure out why I had been invited. I recall that some of my friends were there, including Ben and his family, but they weren't Catholic either. At one point, while our row was standing, everyone started walking to the front to get something from the priest. I didn't know what to do, so I started going with them. Ben's mom grabbed my arm and sat me back down into my seat. Startled, I looked over at her. She was emphatically shaking her head no. The priest, who had been rather solemn until then, was trying to hold back a laugh. No one had told me Protestant churches were any different, so I was expecting something similar. To me, the sanctuary of First Baptist Norfolk looked like an auditorium of sorts. I guessed that all the church stuff happened elsewhere, but I couldn't see where. I sat with Abba in the balcony, toward the back. Even though neither of us knew what the play was about, Abba was glad I had accepted the invitation. He said it would have been rude not to, and that it was a good way to keep the door of conversation open with Betsy. He was proud of me for sharing my beliefs, and he was hoping to help me process the play we were about to see. The play was called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, and it turned out to be a performance of the Christian salvation message. It was during the play that I learned Christians called this message the gospel. I had thought that the word gospel only referred to the 4 books about Jesus. Throughout the play, the message came across loud and clear. Accept Jesus as your Lord, and you will go to heaven. Otherwise, you will go to hell. Different scenarios were performed, each one ending with someone's death and his reception into heaven, or damnation to hell, based solely on whether he had accepted Jesus. The imagery in the play was not subtle. When someone was sent to hell, red and yellow lights flashed through the room, a thunderous cacophony played over the loudspeakers, and Satan came rampaging through the set, dragging the sinner off the stage. On the other hand, if someone had accepted Jesus, he would be ushered by radiant angels into a bright door, ecstatic with joy. In the final scenario, a man was driving a car and his passenger was talking to him about Jesus. The man said he had done many bad things and ignored God his whole life. The passenger was able to convince the driver that he was a sinner and needed Jesus, so the driver prayed a prayer. No sooner had he prayed than a terrible accident occurred. Both men died, dramatically depicted by turning off the lights. When the lights came back on, beautiful music was playing and the driver was escorted into heaven. I'm not sure if it was intentional, but it was ingenious to end the play with that scene right before we all got into our cars to drive home. We started our follow-up discussion as soon as we put on our seatbelts. Nabeel, what did you think of the play? I think it was silly, Abba. They were obviously trying to play on people's fears and emotions. Yes, I agree, Beta, but sometimes that's not bad. We should be frightened of hell, and we should be frightened of Allah's wrath. I was nonplussed. So you think the play was good? Abba laughed. I didn't say that. I think there was something much worse than their attempts to scare people. Well, the message is all wrong, I started, collecting my thoughts. What they're teaching people is they can do whatever they want their whole lives, and all they have to do is say a prayer, and they'll go to heaven. Abba nodded. Right, and what's wrong with that? What's the purpose of religion? The purpose of religion is to make good people and a good society. If people can do whatever they want, they will indulge their sinful desires and society will fall apart. They have a blank check to sin. Even Hitler could go to heaven just by accepting Jesus. Abba prompted me on. And that's why America is the way it is. Christians teach that there is no accountability for their deeds. Good. Very good, Beta. So when your friend at school asks you what you thought, make sure you share that with her. But don't leave her with just that. You need to sweep away falsehood with the truth. What is the truth about judgment? Allah judges us based on our choices in this world. Everything we do is recorded by angels, one on our right shoulder recording our good deeds, and one on our left shoulder recording our bad deeds. When we stand before Allah, our deeds will be read aloud. No one will be able to intercede for us, not our family, not Jesus, not even Muhammad. Allah will weigh our good deeds and our bad, and if our good deeds are greater than our bad deeds, Allah will give us paradise. What about Christians, Bilou? Can Christians go to heaven? Yes, the Quran says that if Christians and Jews believe in one God and do good deeds, they can go to heaven. I was referring to a Quranic verse that is a point of controversy among Muslims. Some Muslims argue that this verse was abrogated by a later Quranic verse that says, if someone comes to Allah with a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him. Other Muslims, our Jamaat among them, reconcile the two verses by arguing that Islam here does not refer to the faith system, but to the broader meaning of the word, peace. The latter interpretation is obviously more tenuous, but only if one believes in the doctrine of abrogation. Surah 2:116 and 16:101 of the Quran both apparently teach that Allah can cancel older sections of the Quran with newer ones. Traditionally, Muslims developed a field of Quranic exegesis called the abrogation and the abrogated, in which they strove to determine the criteria and history of Quranic abrogation. Some Muslim scholars taught that up to 500 verses of the Quran no longer apply because later verses abrogated them. Other Muslim scholars taught that as few as 5 verses were abrogated. Regardless of the exact number, most orthodox sects of Islam believe in the doctrine of abrogation. A few Muslims dissent on this view, and the Ahmadi Jamaat is among them. These Muslims argue that if any part of the Quran could be cancelled, then it would not be the eternal word of God. They resort instead to harmonization of apparently abrogated verses, like the tenuous interpretation above. The difficulty for this view, though, is that the Hadith are full of accounts of abrogation. But I didn't know these things at the time. All I knew was what our Jamaat taught about salvation, and that anyone who believed in one God could go to heaven, as at least one verse of the Quran clearly stated. And how many gods do Christians believe in, Bilou? Some believe in one, some believe in three. Yes, and the Quran says it would be better for them if they stopped saying three. That is why I'm glad you're having these conversations with your friends. They at least need to hear that there is only one God. If you can bring them to Islam and Ahmadiyat, that would be even better. Before wrapping up our conversation on salvation, he quickly added, "But don't spend too much time with this girl. Girls are dangerous for you, especially at this age. You are like a fire and they are like oil. Even if you are not attracted to each other, after time, just being close to each other causes you to start burning. That is how you were made." Okay, Abba, gosh, I got it. Can we talk about something else? Ami and Abba were only too willing to give me the fire and oil talk. It served to remind me that when the time was right, we would come together as a family and discuss whom I would like to marry. If I had a girl in mind, my parents would then talk to her and try to arrange the marriage. If not, my parents would find a suitable wife. I would not date anyone at all, let alone a Western girl. To do so would be to depart from tradition. Chapter 16. Treasured Traditions. Tradition is the outward structure of Islam, the body animated by the soul of Islamic teaching. It seeped into us through immersion in the Muslim lifestyle. Every single day was imbued with tradition. I strived to pray the Salat 5 times a day, recited many detailed du'as, followed intricate instructions for ceremonial washings, and regularly looked to Muhammad's example for guidance. More than 1 billion Muslims joined me in adherence to traditions, whether praying about whom to marry, determining the appropriate length of a beard, or deciding whether to wear gold. But these traditions did not come from the Quran. They are found in Hadith. From marital rights to marital restrictions, commercial laws to civil suits, the vast majority of Sharia and the Islamic way of life is derived from the Hadith. There is no overestimating the importance of Hadith in the Islamic world. As Baji and I grew older, Ami and Abba considered it very important that we learn Hadith and their precepts. They often read from Hadith collections, urging us to memorize the Arabic and understand its meaning. The first time they asked us to memorize a Hadith was immediately after Maghrib prayer one evening, while our family was still on the prayer rugs. "Beti, Beta, we want you to memorize this short Hadith." Hazrat Umar narrates that Muhammad said, "Deeds are judged by their intentions." After we recited the Arabic a few times, Ami and Abba were satisfied that we had memorized it. They asked if we had any questions. I had a few. "Abba, what book of Hadith does this one come from?" "This one comes from Sahih Bukhari." "What can you tell us about Sahih Bukhari?" "It is the most trustworthy book of Hadith compiled by Imam Bukhari. The Hadith were not collected into books until a long time after Muhammad's death. Many false Hadiths had been fabricated, and it was difficult to determine which ones were accurate. Imam Bukhari sifted through 500,000 Hadith and picked out the 5,000 most accurate." Ami followed up, asking, "And how did he do that?" "When Imam Bukhari heard a Hadith, he assessed whether the person telling the Hadith was trustworthy or not. If he had a bad reputation, if he had ever gotten into trouble, or even if he treated animals poorly, Imam Bukhari ignored that Hadith. If he found the person trustworthy, he would ask him from whom he had heard the Hadith, and who the person heard it from, and who that person heard it from, all the way back to Muhammad. Imam Bukhari assessed the reputation of each individual in the chain, and if they were all trustworthy, then Imam Bukhari recorded the Hadith in his book. The chain of transmission was called the Isnad, and it was immeasurably important to classical Muslim scholars. Islam arose in an authority-based society. When they asked the question, "Is this Hadith authentic?" they answered by deferring to the authorities who transmitted it. Without the Isnad, the Hadith was considered worthless. Muslims put less stock into Sirah literature than Hadith specifically because Sirah does not record Isnad. Ami continued, Very good. Beti, what is the next most trustworthy book of Hadith? I don't know, Ami. Baji was now 18 years old and in college. She did not enjoy these detailed questions like she once had, but Ami wouldn't let her off that easy. Yes, you do. Halo, just answer this one, and that will be it. What is next after Sahih Bukhari? Sahih Muslim? Shabash. Nabil, do you know any others? I know Sunan Abu Dawud, and I know that there are six that we consider authentic, and the rest are a mix of reliable and unreliable hadith. The six are called Sahih Sita, and the first three are Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and Sunan Abu Dawud. Abba continued the list for me, and the other three are Sunan Tirmidhi, Sunan Ibn Majah, and Sunan Nisai. These are the best six books of hadith, but among them Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim are the most trustworthy. Ami quickly added, but even the most accurate ones are the word of Muhammad, not the word of Allah. We must not equate the hadith to the Quran. I pushed on this clarification. But if Muhammad said it, don't we have to obey him? Abba interjected, of course, but still, Muhammad is not God. The Quran is the only uncorrupted, perfect book in the world. The books of Hadith are more like the Bible because they are the works of men. There is divine truth there, but we have to be careful of corruption. We always have to check the truths we get from other sources against the Quran. Khalo, that's enough for tonight. Don't forget the Hadith you learned today. We'll ask you to recite it tomorrow. I was very interested in the Hadith, not so much in their content as much as in their history and the ways Muslim scholars assessed them. I wanted to become adept at recognizing authentic Hadith from fabricated ones. I started asking Ami and Abba more about the systems of grading Hadith, and I quickly became against the boundaries of their knowledge in these matters. In order to learn more, I would have to wait until our next Jamaat gathering, when I could ask the experts about the right books to buy to find out more. It so happened that Ami and Abba decided to go back to the United Kingdom during the upcoming summer to attend a Jamaat gathering. I decided to do some research while there. What I didn't plan, though, was to experience God in a very personal way. God was going to perform a miracle that changed my life forever. Chapter 17. Signs in the Sky. It was my first time back in Britain since we had moved to Connecticut 8 years prior. I could hardly contain my excitement. Abba did not even have a chance to get us out of Heathrow Airport before I managed to get a bottle of Iron Brew and a bag of Hula Hoops crisps. We headed back to the Tilford countryside, the same site where we had attended the centenary 9 years earlier. As we drove past quaint English towns, I felt like I was taking a tour through my past. The narrow roads, clustered buildings, and smaller vehicles all brought back memories of a childhood I loved. Even the thought of English food didn't bother me. This Jamaat gathering was called Jalsa. Our family attended the United States Jalsa every year in Washington, D.C., and we usually attended the Canadian Jalsa as well. But the United Kingdom Jalsa was different. This is where the leader of our Jamaat lived, and it always felt special to be in his presence. Because of him, tens of thousands of Ahmadis attended the United Kingdom Jalsa. As much as I anticipated seeing him, the people I most longed for were my friends from Scotland, the Maliks. Apart from one letter that I received from the youngest brother while I was in 7th grade, I had not heard from any of them. Public email was still in its nascent phase, and international phone calls were too expensive to justify. But when I arrived at the Jalsa, I realized I did not know if my friends would even be there. As special as the gathering was, there were myriad circumstances that could preclude their attendance. It would be nearly impossible to look for them by walking through the Jalsa, too. Apart from the sheer number of people to search through, we had all grown up over the previous 7 years, and I was not sure I would recognize them even if I saw them. I sorely wanted to reunite with them, but I did not know where to start. So I turned to God. From a very early age, Ami had trained me to respond in dire moments with prayer, but I knew of no dua for finding people. I had memorized a prayer to recite when looking for lost items, but given that it was the same prayer we recite when we hear the news of someone's death, I decided it would not be apt for the occasion. Instead, I just prayed from my heart, bowing my head and closing my eyes. God, can you please help me find my friends? I had nothing else to say, so I said nothing else. When I opened my eyes, what I saw stunned me stock still. In the air before me were two streaks of color, one gold and one silver, as if whimsically painted onto the sky by an ethereal brush. They trailed into the distance, obviously leading me somewhere. I still remember the words I spoke in shock. You're kidding. I'm supposed to follow those, right? Whether I was speaking to God or myself, I am not sure. What I intrinsically knew was that no one could see the stripes but me. They were not so much in the sky as they were in my perception of the sky. They were neither a mile away, nor a foot away, nor anywhere in between. They just were, and they were waiting for me. The Jalsa was crowded, and everyone was outside the tents because there was no speech currently in session. I followed the streaks into swarms of people, sifting my way through the crowd as if in a Pakistani bazaar. And in fact, the streaks swirled over the Jalsa marketplace, the same area where I wanted to go for a badge almost a decade prior. This time I was not intercepted by a surly senior citizen. Instead, the streaks funneled downward, dissipating over a space next to a clothing tent. When I weeded my way to the clearing, I saw two men standing there, chatting and trying on skullcaps. It took a moment, but I recognized them. They were the older Malik brothers. I ran to them and grasped their arms. When they recognized me, we rejoiced together. They were incredulous at my height, incessantly repeating, "You were just a wee boy," and so they dragged me through the Jalsa, reintroducing me to everyone from Glasgow, whom I once knew. We were overjoyed. For the time being, the streaks in the sky were forgotten. Later that evening, as I considered the day's events while lying in bed, I could not get past the gold and silver streaks. To me, there was nothing else for it. They meant God must exist. Of course, I already believed that God existed. I had seen answered prayers, prophetic dreams, and rational argumentation pointing toward the existence of God, but there was always room for doubt. Perhaps the answered prayers were coincidences, or maybe the prophetic dreams were exaggerated over time to fit reality. Or it was possible they were flaws in the logic of the arguments. Sure, I was 99% certain that God existed, but that shadow of doubt was always there. But now, there was no remotely plausible alternative. How else could I explain what happened that day? I had no idea where my friends were, and when I prayed, I was supernaturally led to them. I began to consider alternative explanations. Maybe I had imagined the streaks. No, that couldn't work, because I went straight to my friends. Maybe I subconsciously knew where my friends were. No, that was impossible. I did not even know if they were at the Jalsa, let alone at that exact spot in the marketplace. Perhaps while I lived in Scotland, I developed extrasensory connections with my friends that remained dormant until I called on them that afternoon, whereupon our psychic bonds were able to manifest themselves in my visual sensorium. Honestly, that was the best naturalistic explanation I could come up with, but not only did it skirt the boundaries of naturalism, it totally blew past the boundaries of plausibility. No, I told myself, there is no alternative. God is real, and He hears my prayers, even the little ones like wanting to know where my friends are. That day, I no longer just believed that God was real. I knew God was real, and I knew God cared for me. The timing could not have been better. When I returned to Princess Anne for my junior year, one of my mandatory classes was Theory of Knowledge, TOK, and it served as an introductory course to general philosophy and epistemology. Our textbook was called Man is the Measure, and one of the first discussions we had in class was, how can we know whether God exists? The discussions were deep and shook the faith of many theists in the class. Although our conversations focused on objective argumentation, as they should have, I came to realize that subjective knowledge can be far more powerful. I would never be able to convince anyone that I actually saw the streaks in the sky or that they actually led me to my friends. But I did not need to. It was a sign for me, and I went from being 99% sure that God exists to 100% certain. 4 years later, when my world started falling apart, that 1% made all the difference. Chapter 18: Honor and Authority. TOK was one of the many classes that I had with my best friend David. We had grown closer and closer since 7th grade, and by the time we were upperclassmen, we were inseparable. We had 6 of our 7 classes together, became co-captains of the academic trivia team, and entered into the forensics team as a duo. David and I won 5th place in the state competition our junior year, surprising everyone because we were both rookies. During senior year, we won the state championship. David and I had a few discussions about religion and the existence of God. He and I did not see eye to eye, and it was clear that our upbringing had a lot to do with it. He was hesitant to move past agnosticism, and my starting point was Islam. The discussions in TOK seemed to bolster his hesitance, and although it did not shake my conviction in God's existence, it did bring some critical differences between Eastern and Western cultures into sharp relief. When my parents taught me to examine my beliefs, I was essentially expected to build a defense for what they had taught me. In TOK, we were ostensibly doing the same thing, examining our beliefs. But in practice, it was the exact opposite. We were critically probing our beliefs, challenging them, testing them for weak points, pliability, and boundaries. Some students were even replacing them. This difference between Eastern and Western education can be traced to the disparity that divides Muslim immigrants from their children. Islamic cultures tend to establish people of high status as authorities, whereas the authority in Western culture is reason itself. These alternative seats of authority permeate the mind, determining the moral outlook of whole societies. When authority is derived from position rather than reason, the act of questioning leadership is dangerous because it has the potential to upset the system. Dissension is reprimanded and obedience is rewarded. Correct and incorrect courses of action are assessed socially, not individually. A person's virtue is thus determined by how well he meets social expectations, not by an individual determination of right and wrong. Thus, positional authority yields a society that determines right and wrong based on honor and shame. On the other hand, when authority is derived from reason, questions are welcomed because critical examination sharpens the very basis of authority. Each person is expected to critically examine his own course of action. Correct and incorrect courses of action are assessed individually. A person's virtue is determined by whether he does what he knows to be right or wrong. Rational authority creates a society that determines right and wrong based on innocence and guilt. Much of the West's inability to understand the East stems from the paradigmatic schism between honor-shame cultures and innocence-guilt cultures. Of course, the matter is quite complex, and elements of both paradigms are present in the East and the West. But the honor-shame spectrum is the operative paradigm that drives the East, and it is hard for Westerners to understand. This reliance on positional authority explains some characteristics in parts of the Muslim world that confound many Westerners, such as the continued practices of honor killings, child brides of 6 or younger, and blood feuds. For one reason or another, the prevailing sources of social authority in these regions deem these customs acceptable, perhaps even preferable. No amount of sheer reason is going to change these practices, nor will externally imposed prohibitions. The change will have to be social, internal, and organic. But honor killings and blood feuds are generally not struggles for children raised as second-generation Western Muslims. We wrestle with the honor-shame principle that tells us it's okay as long as you don't get caught. If there is no dishonor, it is not wrong. I saw this principle play out many times while I was growing up, though I am obliged to share only innocuous accounts. The most innocent one I can think of has to do with free refills. Many of my Muslim friends thought it was perfectly acceptable to order water from fast food restaurants and then go to the dispenser and fill up on soda. We rarely blinked an eye at this, and I myself did it regularly. But at a Taco Bell in Virginia Beach one day, one of my friends was caught getting Mountain Dew Code Red instead of water. A young employee had glanced over the counter and seen my friend filling up on soda. Without much tact, he pushed my friend's hand away from the fountain drinks and said loudly, "You ordered water. You can't get soda." At this, many people turned to see the commotion, and my friend immediately blushed. It was obvious that the employee was correct, since the cups for water were transparent and the cups for soda were opaque. The employee caught him literally red-handed. The soda was clearly visible to all. For my friend, this was the moment that made his actions a poor choice. He had suffered dishonor in front of many. Stealing the soda was not an issue for him before being caught. In fact, it was still not the issue after being caught. As strange as it might sound to Westerners, it was more dishonorable for him to be called out by a minimum wage employee than to be caught stealing soda. So he denied it, asserting firmly, "I am getting water." He filled the rest of the cup with water and walked away from the counter as if it were perfectly normal for water to be a deep, bubbly pink. On another occasion, one of my cousins was receiving some light-hearted ridicule from the rest of my family for having been caught committing minor insurance fraud. To help alleviate the shame, my cousin turned it into a funny story for us all. He started by telling us that, as he was getting quotes for auto insurance, he found he would save a lot of money if he lied and told the insurance company he was married. So he made up a long backstory about meeting his wife, what she did for a living, and even the mnemonic he used to remember her birthday. He planned to tell the agent that he had unfortunately did not have any papers since she was still in Pakistan. When he had invented enough details, he called a company, convinced them he was married, and secured the lower rate. Only one other family member and I chided him for this, and we were both American-born. The elders laughed and told us to lighten up, asserting that the insurance companies had enough money as it was. My cousin boisterously agreed. As the story went, over a year later, he had a fender bender and needed to make a roadside claim. While sharing details of the accident on the phone, the insurance agent asked him if he was with his wife. His mind on the accident, he responded that he did not have a wife. Unfazed, the agent asked him if he had ever been married, and my cousin replied, "No." Shortly thereafter, my cousin received an adjusted insurance rate well over twice what he had been paying. By the time the story was through, the family was roaring with laughter. For having told such a good story, he was able to transform the shame of being caught lying into the honor of being a good storyteller. Actually doing the right thing did not even enter into the equation, and neither did guilt. These are relatively harmless examples of how an honor-shame culture might see things differently from a Western culture of guilt and innocence. Of course, there is a highly developed notion of morality in Islam, so we must take care not to oversimplify the matter and assume that Muslims do whatever they wish if they believe they will not be caught. All the same, it is safe to say that guilt is less of a determining factor in the East than is shame. Coming back to second-generation Muslim Westerners, it might now be easier to see just how difficult it can be to straddle these two cultures. When engaged in something less than socially acceptable, the young Muslim will be tempted to hide it and will begin to struggle with internal guilt. The natural Eastern tendency to hide shameful truths exacerbates the Western tendency to feel guilty. For me, this became a major problem as I progressed through high school. All my friends knew that I was Muslim and that I was not allowed to date. I had done my best to be an ambassador for my culture by telling others I was happy about the idea of an arranged marriage, and it truly didn't bother me until I started developing a real interest in girls. In my senior year, I developed a crush on a girl who also confessed she was interested in me. By anyone's standards in the West, it was a very innocent relationship, holding hands and speaking romantic words. But still, I kept it secret because it went against my Eastern standards, and I felt very guilty. I called it off after a matter of weeks, even though I still had feelings for her. Not long after, she started dating my best friend, David. My feelings for her were unabated, and after a while I felt very guilty for having a crush on my best friend's girlfriend. I confessed to David that I had had a secret relationship with her before they started dating and that I still had feelings for her. None of my friends understood why I had hid this from them, least of all David. From his perspective, I had utterly betrayed him by not being open with him and for harboring feelings for his girlfriend. There was a falling out between David and me just days before graduation, with everyone on one side and me on the other. Once again I was friendless, but this time I was deeply hurt and utterly confused. What had happened? Why did I always end up alone? I knew I had done something wrong, but was it so wrong that I deserved to lose all my friends? I went to no graduation parties. I was no longer invited to any of the pre-college trips we had planned. I did not get to see my friends off as they went to college, and I was unable to reunite with everyone when they returned home for breaks. Had I understood the way I was acting at the time, I might have done things differently. Had they understood me, they might have been less hurt by my secrets. Had we only known, I might still have my childhood friends today. Some believe that cultural differences between East and West do not exist, that people all see the world the same way. Others consider the Eastern and Western paradigms as a curiosity to consider. But for me and for others like me, the schism between East and West shapes the very course of our lives. Because of it, I had no friends in my early childhood, and because of it, I was launched into adulthood alone once more. Thankfully, the worst of the pain lasted only the summer. I started college a few months later, in August of 2001, looking forward to the prospect of reinventing myself and finding new friends. But just 3 weeks into college, a new crisis hit, and this one affected our entire nation. The world would never be the same again. Chapter 19. The Religion of Peace. It was the beginning of my 4th week at Old Dominion University. Baji and I both attended ODU for the same reason. It was the best school close to home, and Ami and Abi would not let us go any farther. We often went to school together, but on Tuesday mornings, Baji would come after me to avoid waiting in traffic. I had to be at my anatomy lab by 8 o'clock. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I finished in the anatomy lab at 10:30 and headed toward Webb Center, the student union at ODU. I was free until the afternoon, when the forensics team met for practice. I had joined the team the first week of school and was excited to see if I could carry my high school success into college. As I strolled through the entrance of the student union, the captain of the forensics team strode on hurriedly. I had no idea anything was amiss, so I asked, "What's going on?" Without stopping, she said, "The second tower just came down." Confused, I saw a crowd by the televisions in the lounge behind her, so I made my way there. The news stations were playing and replaying footage of the north and south towers of the World Trade Center collapsing. Over and over they played the images of a plane crashing into one of the towers and each tower successively crumbling. It felt like a scene out of a movie, but we were transfixed by a very real horror. No one moved and no one spoke. After a few moments, my phone rang. It was Abba, his voice uncharacteristically pressured. "Nabeel, where are you? Why haven't you been picking up your phone?" "I'm at school, Abba. I didn't have reception in the anatomy lab." "Come home now. Is Baji with you?" "No. Is she okay?" "She's not picking up her phone either. Find her and come home right away." Still reeling from the previous few minutes, I tried to fit the pieces together. "Abba, what's wrong? Why do I have to come home?" Surprised, Abba asked, "Don't you know? There has been an attack." "Yes, but why does that mean I have to come home?" "Nabeel, they're blaming Muslims. People will be emotional and they could take it out on you or Baji. It's your job to find her. Make sure she's safe and come home." "But Abba, Abba wasted no more time. "Nabeel, do as I say. I have to call Baji. Keep your phone close." With that, he hung up. I looked around at the people watching the televisions. Were these people my enemies? Could they really want to hurt me? Slowly, the danger shifted from being on the television to being all around me. I was now a part of this macabre movie, and I had a role to play. I left quickly and called Baji. To my great relief, she picked up. Assalamu alaikum. Baji, do you know what's going on? Where are you? Yes, I'm in my car. I'm going home. Why weren't you picking up your phone when Abba called? I was at 7-Eleven watching the TV and a policeman pulled me aside. He told me it might not be safe to stay out because I'm wearing a burqa. He offered to escort me back to my car and now I'm going home. Really? That was nice of him. Okay, drive safely. I'll see you at home soon. For the rest of the day we stayed glued to the television. Abba made arrangements to take the week off and he told us to do the same. We left the home only to buy American flags which were quickly selling out. We displayed flags prominently on each car, in our yard, and kept a few in the garage just in case. We wanted people to know that we weren't the enemy, no matter what they were hearing on the news. This was not paranoia on my father's part. During Operation Desert Storm, members of my family had been targeted and victimized. Nani Ami was refused service at a gas station in New York because she wore a burqa. Nani Ami, my sweet little grandmother, a distant aunt of ours, had even been assaulted in a parking lot, punched in the stomach while getting groceries. Indeed, not long after the September 11th attacks, the mosque that sat at the outskirts of ODU was vandalized, all of its windows broken. I knew the people who paid to repair the mosque. They were good, hard-working people. As the days progressed, it became clear that the hijackers were indeed Muslim and that this attack on our nation had been carried out in the name of Islam. But what Islam was this? It was clearly not the Islam I knew. True, I used to hear of Muslims in distant lands committing atrocities in the name of Allah, but those accounts were too remote to create any cognitive dissonance. This hit much closer to home. This hit us in our hearts. Over the following weeks, news stations mercilessly looped footage of the crumbling towers. Again and again and again I witnessed thousands of innocent massacred in the name of my God. It finally became too much. I had to learn the truth about my faith once and for all. I had to figure out how to reconcile my Islam, a religion of peace, with the Islam on television, a religion of terror. In the 12 years since that day, I have learned that the question is far more complex than it first appears. The most important consideration is the definition of Islam. If by Islam we mean the beliefs of Muslims, then Islam can be a religion of peace or a religion of terror, depending on how it is taught. In the West, Muslims are generally taught a very pacific version of Islam. Just like Baji and I, Western Muslims are taught that Muhammad fought only defensive battles and that violent verses in the Quran refer to specific defensive contexts. Jihad is here defined as primarily a peaceful endeavor, an internal struggle against one's baser desires. When asked about their religion, Western Muslims honestly report what they believe. Islam is a religion of peace. In the East, though, Muslims often have a less docile view of Islam. They are taught that Islam is superior to all other religions and ways of life, and that Allah wishes to see it established throughout the world. They often define jihad as a primarily physical endeavor, a struggle against the enemies of Islam. When asked about their religion, these Muslims will honestly report what they believe. Islam will dominate the world. So if we define Islam by the beliefs of its adherents, it may or may not be a religion of peace. But if we define Islam more traditionally as the system of beliefs and practices taught by Muhammad, then the answer is less ambiguous. The earliest historical records show that Muhammad launched offensive military campaigns and used violence at times to accomplish his purposes. He used the term jihad in both spiritual and physical contexts, but the physical jihad is the one Muhammad strongly emphasizes. The peaceful practice of Islam hinges on later, often Western, interpretations of Muhammad's teachings, whereas the more violent variations of Islam are deeply rooted in orthodoxy and history. Of course, like all people, Muslims in the East and West generally just believe what they are taught. Rarely is there much critical investigation into historical events, and the few that invest the effort usually do the same thing I had done in my TOK class: attempt to defend what is already believed, potentially ignoring or underestimating evidence that points to the contrary. This is only natural, since it is extremely difficult to change beliefs that are dear to the heart. Such was the case with me. In my heart of hearts, I wanted to know the truth about Islam, but it would be nearly impossible to challenge my childhood beliefs just by investigating them. I would keep finding ways to ignore difficult truths. What I needed was something that would not let me get away with my biases. I needed something that would mercilessly loop my bad arguments before my eyes again and again and again until I could avoid them no longer. I needed a friend, an intelligent, uncompromising, non-Muslim friend who would be willing to challenge me. Of course, not only would he have to be bold and stubborn enough to deal with the likes of me, but I would have to like and trust him enough to dialogue with him about the things that mattered to me most. Little did I know, God had already introduced us, and I was already on a path that would change my life forever. To read an expert contribution on East Meets West by Mark Mittelberg, a best-selling author and primary creator of the evangelism course Becoming a Contagious Christian, see page 301. East Meets West, Mark Mittelberg, contributing to Part 2, An Ambassador for Islam. Mark Mittelberg is best-selling author and primary creator of the course Becoming a Contagious Christian, which has trained 1.5 million people worldwide and has been translated into more than 20 languages. He served as evangelism director with the Willow Creek Association for more than a decade. It is important for you to know that Allah is the one and only God, and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was his true prophet. God is not divided, and he does not have a son, and Jesus, peace be upon him, was not the Son of God. He was a true prophet, like Muhammad, and we are to honor him, but we must never worship him. We worship Allah and Allah alone. These bold words, spoken by the Imam, a man dressed in white who stood in front of our group and was clearly in charge of the mosque that day, were communicated in a manner that delivered more than just theological content. They were conveyed with an authority that made clear that the message was something we were expected to accept rather than test. It was not that the Imam wasn't willing to entertain a few questions. Rather, he apparently saw this as a chance to challenge the thinking of an entire group of Christians at one time. So after a short period of teachings, he opened the floor to whatever issues we wanted to raise. But even then, he responded with an emphatic tone, one that relayed his belief that he had the truth and we were there to learn it. This assuredness was borne out when I finally raised my own question. I asked the Imam why he and other Muslims denied that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died on the cross, and that he rose from the dead 3 days later. As politely as I knew how, I explained that I and the others from my church who were visiting the mosque that day believed these things on the basis of the testimonies of Jesus' own disciples. They were the ones who walked and talked with him for 3 years and who heard him make repeated claims to be the Son of God. They saw him die on the cross and met, talked with, and even ate with him after his resurrection. And they were the ones who made sure it was all written down in the New Testament Gospels. What I'm curious about, I said, concluding my question, is whether you have any historical or logical reasons why we should accept your Muslim point of view over and against what we understand to be the actual historical record. The Imam looked at me intently and then declared resolutely, "I choose to believe the Prophet." With that, our time for questions was over. East meets West indeed. I walked away that day with a fresh awareness that we do not all approach questions about truth in the same way. In fact, years later, I wrote about what I believe is a characteristically Eastern versus a characteristically Western approach to gaining knowledge. In the East, and for Islam in particular, what is accepted as true is generally what the authorities tell you, and you are expected to embrace what they teach. That is why I call this approach the authoritarian faith path. In fact, the original meaning of the Arabic word Islam is submission. It seems fair to say that the prevailing tenor of the Muslim faith is one of submitting to, not questioning, what the religion teaches. This squares with my friend Nabeel Qureshi's assessment in this part 2 of his book. People from Eastern Islamic cultures generally assess truth through lines of authority, not individual reasoning. Of course, individuals do engage in critical reasoning in the East, but on average it is relatively less valued and far less prevalent than in the West. Leaders have done the critical reasoning, and leaders know best. As Nabeel indicates, this contrasts sharply with the more typical approach in the West, which I refer to as the evidential faith path. This approach decides what should be accepted as true based not on the word of authorities, but rather on logic and experience, including experiences recorded in trustworthy historical records like the ones I cited in my interactions with the Imam. Of course, both sides can have their pitfalls. Westerners in the evidential mindset often need to be reminded to be lovers of truth. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 10. Who are willing to rigorously apply reason and the study of evidence, and then follow them wherever they lead. Too often, people in Western culture fall into an approach that limits possible causes to naturalistic ones, and they won't even consider supernatural causes. This prejudices the outcome and, in fact, makes scientific and historical inquiry atheistic by definition. But if we can help people reopen their minds to the full gamut of possible explanations, then I'm confident that logic and evidence, along with the inner workings of the Holy Spirit, will lead them back not only to a belief in God, but also to the Christian faith. Easterners who embrace an authoritarian mindset need to be reminded that religious authorities are not all created equal. Some are worth following and some are not. If the credentials of the leaders are not scrutinized and their message is not weighed, how can one know which should be followed? The Bible encourages us to test everything, hold fast what is good. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 21 ESV, and warns, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. 1 John chapter 4 verse 1 ESV. The question is, will Easterners have the courage and tenacity to apply the needed tests? This can be challenging because, as Nabeel reminds us, when authority is derived from position rather than reason, the act of questioning leadership is dangerous because it has the potential to upset the system. Dissension is reprimanded and obedience is rewarded. Thankfully, more and more Muslims are willing to face the inherent dangers and discomforts in order to seek not only the truth, but ultimately the one who said he is the truth. John chapter 14 verse 6. Nabeel is an inspiring example, one I trust many others will emulate.